Thank you all. Thank you all for coming out on a night like this after a weekend of protest, a weekend of resistance. I saw a lot of hands about people who were out. This is great. These events have been going on all over the country. You know, it's somewhere around 1,500 separate events. Small towns, as you all were saying, where 300 people, 500 people show up. This is a new moment, and it's important, and it's amazing. This has been, as you all know, a very difficult 18 months for people who care about the Middle East, for people who care about Palestine, for people who care about people who are human beings. It's been very hard to live through what we have been seeing 24/7 for 18 months now on our phones and on our screens and our computers and our social media and in every other way. And it's a hard time here because of what we're facing. We're facing a new kind of fascism that no one alive today consciously remembers ever having happened before. We've seen it happen in other countries. We haven't seen it here. And the fight back is what gives us courage and gives us hope that it's not going to go further than this. And the question of US enabling of these attacks on Palestinians is a part of that. It's not separate. This is not a different issue. This is the international version of what fascism looks like at home. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind when we think about our own obligations and our own responsibility for what our government, whether or not we voted for any particular candidate, we have a government that operates with our tax dollars in our name, with or without our consent. So that means we have some really important obligations and responsibility. And, you know, some of that has to do with numbers. It's hard. It's hard keeping track of the numbers of people who have been killed, the numbers of children. I was taking some notes before I left on this tour, some notes in, I guess, 4 days ago. And I wrote down the most recent figures we had, that of the 51+ thousand Palestinians that have been killed in these 18 months by Israeli assault, 17,000+ of them have been children. And that just since Israel broke the ceasefire on March 2nd, there were 322 children had been killed. I looked tonight, just before we came over here, and I have to cross that out. It's now 490 children, just since Israel broke the ceasefire. And that's not even counting the children that are among the dead under the rubble of the buildings, most of whom will never be recovered. Their bodies will never be recovered. And it's a scale of killing that we have not seen in front of us so directly. We have not watched this in real time ever before. There have been certainly other genocides. The first genocide of the 20th century was in Namibia, what was then called Southwest Africa, of Black Africans by Germany. That was the first genocide, long before the word was ever invented. And even the more modern genocides, the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, which leaders knew about, and there was some coverage of it a little bit, but we didn't see it 24/7 happening before our eyes. This is different. And part of it has led to a different response, which is important and positive, in the sense that for the first time we've seen a movement rise up. Not the first movement for Palestinian rights. There's been a movement for Palestinian rights active in this country for decades, for 25, 45 years. This was not that. This was not, let's say this was not only that. This was a movement that emerged spontaneously from people operating as human beings, saying, this is not acceptable. I will not stand by and allow this to happen in real time as I watch it, with bombs that we paid for, that we built. Our criminal budget for the military, which is now close to $1 trillion, half of that goes to these military contractors whose CEOs make in the multi-million dollars themselves. But we're talking somewhere in the area of more than $400 billion that goes to these corporations here in the United States to make the bombs and the planes that drop them. And understanding that is part of, I think, how we have to understand how our obligations come together. And that partly means understanding history. Because, you know, trying to figure out how to think about what we're seeing right in front of us just right now, just today, let alone how do we figure out history, has everything to do with when you start the clock. You know, I just learned that this church was built 200 years ago. This year, it's its 200th anniversary. If we looked at the history of what was happening in this town 200 years ago, where were the indigenous people at that time? And what happened to them since? It's been 200 years, so we don't pay as much attention. When we look at Palestine, we could start the clock, as way too many people and way too many media outlets and way too many members of Congress and the White House, et cetera, have done. We could start the clock on October 7th, 2023, and say terrible things happened on that day. That's true across the board. Whenever we start the clock, some terrible things happened on that day. But if we start the clock on that day, we learn a very different history than if we, for example, start the clock on 17 years before that, in 2007, which was the year that Israel imposed this embargo, this blockade on the people of Gaza. They took a lesson very directly from what the US had done in Iraq after the first Gulf War, for the decade of sanctions in the 1990s, when the US, operating through the United Nations to make it look good, imposed these crippling economic sanctions on the people of Iraq, saying this is only about, we're only trying to sanction Saddam Hussein, one person. But unfortunately, there were tens of millions of people who lived in Iraq, who lived and died from those sanctions. 500,000 children died of sanctions by 1996. That was only 5 years into the sanctions. And our then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was asked about it. We're being told, Madam Secretary, that there are 500,000 children who have been killed by US sanctions. What do you think about that? And without missing a beat, she said, it's a high price, but we think the price is worth it. And I always wanted to say to her, you know, you have 2 daughters. If they were among those 500,000 children, would you say it was worth it? It's one of those staggering things that has everything to do with when you start the clock. If we go back to 1967, 55, I think 56 years before, when Israel first militarily occupied the Gaza Strip, as well as the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai, you would get a very different history still. And if you go back to 1948, what the Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, what Israelis call the War of Independence that gave them their state, when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their home and their land was seized to create this new country, created as a colonial outpost according to the words of the founder of modern Zionism, who wrote in his diaries, Theodor Herzl wrote in his diaries that he had written a letter, maybe several letters, it wasn't very clear, and there's no indication he ever got an answer. But he wrote a letter to the infamous British colonialist, Cecil Rhodes, and said to him that he wanted his help in getting the support of the British Crown in this project that he was going to have, this project to build a Jewish state in Palestine. And he said to Rhodes in this letter, you may wonder, why am I asking you? You're interested in Africa, I'm interested in this little piece of Arabia, you're concerned about Englishmen, I'm concerned about Jews, so why am I asking you? And then he answers his own question, and he says, because our projects are both something colonial. He was very clear about it. There was no defensive anything. I got to say, when I read that, as a young Zionist activist, I was like, whoa, wait a minute, nobody ever taught me that part. And I was sort of done at that point with supporting Israel uncritically, as I had done for my young life. And I think that when we look at the question now that we face, how do we get a ceasefire? The demand for ceasefire now that has been so important. And we now know there can be no ceasefire as long as the Israelis, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, maintains his current position, which he has not wavered on for many, many years, which is that this war will continue after anything that we call a ceasefire. We want the hostages home, and then we'll go back to war. And somehow he thinks that that's how you bring home hostages, when the whole world knows that you bring home hostages through negotiations. It worked for the first batch of hostages in this case. It worked for more hostages this past January. And of the hostages left, he is essentially overtly telling their families and the half of the Israeli public who says that the first priority must be for the Israeli government to bring home the hostages. He's saying the first priority is to destroy Hamas. And that will be our goal. He says the first thing we will do is bring home the hostages. He doesn't say how. And then we will eliminate Hamas. And then we will empty Gaza of Palestinians. He said that again yesterday. That's his 3 steps. Now, having announced that publicly, the intention to commit genocide, more and further, because that meets the definition of genocide, he somehow thinks that someone else will be blamed when there's no ceasefire. He could be right. We in this country, and our government in particular, tends to blame anyone but Israel for all of these things. But I think this time it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder not least because there is this extraordinary movement of people in this country who came into the streets for the first time, some for the first time on any issue, many for the first time on this issue, who had been in the streets for the climate, for women's rights, to stop war, to end racism, but had never come out for Palestine, had never really thought about it maybe, had been afraid that they would be called names if they did, or maybe really thought that Israel was right and the Palestinians were wrong and that Israel deserved the territory, but suddenly realized what the price of creating a state that was a colonial outpost where an indigenous people lived was just too great, was just too much, and they couldn't take it anymore. And what that movement did, that's been so extraordinary, is 2 things. One, they have maintained a level of what we might call message discipline that most of our movement, I've got to say, is not so good at most of the time. You know, people want to say their own chants. They want to say their own demands, right? This time, ceasefire now has been the demand from the beginning. And that's huge. It wasn't only ceasefire now. Soon it was ceasefire now and permanent. But then, the second thing this movement did was something even more extraordinary. As a movement, it redefined what a ceasefire required, so that it was no longer just stop bombing, stop killing people with your guns and your bombs and your warplanes and your tanks, just stop. That's number 1, stop killing people like that. But that's not all. Number 2 of the ceasefire is get in there all of the humanitarian aid that is necessary to bring people back from the edge of death that is now facing particularly babies and the elders. We are now into the 2nd month. It started on March 2nd. Israel announced we are no longer going to allow anything into the Gaza Strip. No food, no medicine, no water, no repair facilities for the water treatment plant, nothing, no fuel. 3 days ago, the UN announced that they were closing all of the World Food Program bakeries that were providing the last bread to the Gaza Strip. 25 bakeries, because they had no more flour and they had no more fuel for the ovens. And they said, we can't ask our people to stay at such risk when they cannot do their job, because their job is to feed people. And they can't feed anyone anymore because there's no food left. Babies are already dying now. There will be more. There will be more. So that was number 2. And this movement took up that cry in the context of saying ceasefire now. And number 3, the most important going forward, stop sending arms. Stop sending the weapons. And we heard that on the streets yesterday, in protest across the country. Stop arming Israel. We see it on signs all over the Pioneer Valley. There's 2 or 3 or 5 organizations in all the different towns that are working on ending aid to Israel. Because as long as the aid continues, it doesn't matter what the president says. You know, our current president, of course, doesn't ever say anything about there's any problem with killing all the Palestinians you want. Our former president, on the other hand, he used to talk a lot about, it's really, you're killing too many Palestinians here. You really have to stop killing so many Palestinians. I'm heartbroken. And I actually think it's probably true. He probably was heartbroken. He's a pretty emotional guy. I bet he was heartbroken. But you know what? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because when you're the president of the United States, what you do is way more important than where your heart is broken. So on the day, just for instance, when 7 Palestinian humanitarian workers were killed, only 6 in Gaza, only 6 sorry, let me start that one again. 6 humanitarian aid workers who were not Palestinian and 1 who was Palestinian. 7 humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen, the US-based global charity. They were killed in a deliberate airstrike. 2 carloads of them who were known, they were marked, they had worked it out with the Israeli military, and they were targeted and killed. And immediately, President Biden said what every president should say in a situation like that: I am heartbroken at this. But 6 hours later, he announced approval of sending $8 billion more worth of weapons to continue killing more people, more humanitarians. You've all been following, I imagine, the 15 first responders who were killed last week, where Israel has now been forced, interestingly, by the New York Times and the BBC, who have not been exactly friendly to the idea of worrying too much about Palestinian lives, had been under enough pressure that they took the initiative to do the investigation that proved unequivocally what Palestinians had said all along, that this was not some accident, that, well, they were shot at because they were approaching soldiers in a dangerous way and they didn't have their lights on, right? They had their lights on. They had their marked ambulance. They had their marked first responder vests on. They were targeted. And after the first one was targeted, they waited for the second 2 ambulances to come. And then they killed everybody in those ambulances, except one of them didn't die, as it turned out. And somehow, between the one who didn't die, who was arrested, beaten, and then released, the fact was that one of the 15 who did die, they somehow forgot to take his cell phone where he had recorded the moments of the coming death and his last words to his mother. And when that happens, apparently even the New York Times responds. So what are we talking about here? What do we have to do? What does this mean for us? This movement that was created on a spontaneous basis all across the country, all different kinds of groups coming out. The Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization I have the privilege of working with, occupied the Grand Central Station in New York. You know, it was 500, 1,000 Jews saying, "Not in our name." That's pretty amazing. Then what was next? The island where you have the Statue of Liberty. They took over that one. You know, Muslims were praying outside the Congress, outside the congressional office buildings. A huge multinational grouping of protesters came in front of Congress. Everybody was coming out in the streets to be part of this movement. And now it's much harder, because now we're trying to fight for Palestinian lives on an emergency basis while continuing to do the long, hard, medium, and long-term work that still needs to be done. But the emergency part, at the same time that we're facing a national emergency in this country with this new administration destroying our government, destroying what shreds of our democracy remains, potentially destroying healthcare and education and all of these things that we have come to depend on, and come to count on, what we should be able to count on living in the wealthiest country that has ever existed in the history of the world, not to mention the strongest militarily of any country. So how do we juggle all this? I think we have the beginnings of a model from what we saw yesterday in these protests. Some of you will remember that the original call for these protests had a list. It was like a shopping list. Hands off education, hands off healthcare, hands off Social Security, hands off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't say hands off Gaza. It didn't say much about foreign policy at all, except what I believe to be a very incorrect, problematic one, which was hands off NATO. NATO is not some progressive thing that we should be supporting, in my view. It was something that should have ended when its purpose, which was to prevent war with the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO had no longer any reason to exist. They should have declared victory if necessary and gone home. They didn't do that, as we know. They instead played a major role in Afghanistan. They were a leading force in Libya, et cetera. They expanded their job instead of saying, we've done our job here, we're going home. We don't need to be supporting NATO. But there was no mention of Palestine. And yet, in virtually all the protests that we're hearing reports of, there were still Palestinian rights contingents, ceasefire now contingents. I was at the one in, where was I? New Haven, right, thank you. I've been moving around a lot. I was in New Haven to speak like this at a lovely bookstore there, and to go to the protest there, because wherever you were on Saturday, that's where you went to protest, right? And the New Haven protest, it didn't have an official presence for, around that demand, but there was a group of terrific young women students who were carrying big Palestinian flags. There was another group with signs saying, ceasefire now. A few others that I saw scattered through the crowd. They were there. And what's crucially important is that they have been welcomed everywhere. So the leaders who drafted the leaflet, we can even, if we want to be generous, we can say maybe they forgot. Whatever. But nobody objected. In some of them, speakers talked about it and talked about the link, why this is not two different issues, that we need two different movements. We are part of the same movement, which is stop spending our money on the military. Our military budget is almost $1 trillion. It's a 970, and that's not counting stuff like the border security and the arrest of people on the streets and federal detention, all those things. This is just the actual Pentagon and nuclear weapon budgets. It's almost $1 trillion. And of that, just about half goes to US corporations that are making a killing, in every sense of the word, on building the bombs, building the planes, selling them at a profit, and giving them to Israel. So all of that is what shapes how we look at what our job is now. This isn't new, of course, the idea of Israel attacking Gaza with US weapons. This is an old story. But because there's something we're seeing in front of us, there's a different kind of movement. And with that broader movement, there's also an understanding that it's our free speech that is at stake here. Because what we're seeing is that the escalation of attacks on the free speech of people across this country, and it's not only Americans, quote, US citizens, who have the right of free speech in our Constitution. It's everyone inside this country has that right under the Constitution. The famous case of Harry Bridges, the trade unionist, who the government tried to say had no right of free speech because he was a supporter. They couldn't even prove he was a member, because he apparently wasn't, but that he was associating with members of the Communist Party, and therefore he had no right to speak. And the Supreme Court, remember when the Supreme Court did stuff like this? They actually said in their ruling, free speech applies to everyone, citizen or not. Somebody along the line forgot that. And we are seeing a pushback. The students that are being picked up on the street, terrified. Some 5, 6 people dressed in black with hoods covering their heads and masks over their faces. No identification, no willingness to say who you are, snatching you, a kidnapping, throw you in the back of an unmarked car, and ship you off from Massachusetts to Louisiana and put you in prison. This is what the beginning of fascism looks like. This is what military coups look like. This is what all of that looks like in the past in other countries. Now it's in this country. But what's happening here is that people are going to court. Neighbors are coming out to protect communities that are at risk. Immigrant communities have instant call committees that have been formed when ICE is in the neighborhood. My neighborhood in Washington, there's a school around the corner, and it's a largely Latino neighborhood, and ICE was seen around the school right at the time that the kids come in, between 8:30 and 9 in the morning. It's an elementary school, for God's sakes. There's 5-year-olds. There's actually 3-year-olds, because they have a preschool there too. And these ICE are floating around, kind of looking and looking, and people realized this is not good. And they contacted the instant mobilization team, and people came out from the school and from the neighborhood and were able, it turned out they were going after the school nurse. The school nurse. And people were able to surround her, escort her back into the school, and ICE left. It was a moment of victory, a small one. But there are a lot of those small victories happening now. And in the lawsuits that are being brought, you know, there was a lawsuit brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights and Palestine Legal against Biden and Blinken in US courts for collaborating with the Israeli genocide. And the judge who made a judgment after several days and a very painful decision, he said that he had no choice but to throw out the case because of the difference between the judicial and executive branches, that he couldn't refuse it. Maybe he could have, but he didn't. But he wrote a scathing opinion about how the witnesses had indicated to him, and he believed it to be true, that this was a genocide. So it's a finding by a US judge that this is genocide. Before we even get to the International Criminal Court, which is so incredibly important because it broke all kinds of taboos, right? About what a third world country is allowed to do, what an African country is allowed to do, what a former colonized country is allowed to do, with an institution like the International Court of Justice, the Court of the United Nations, the official one. The International Criminal Court is a different thing. It's an independent court. This is the UN's court. This is the most powerful court in the world. And South Africa said, you know what? It doesn't just belong to the white colonials. It belongs to us too. And they took Israel to court for violation of the Genocide Convention. And the court, in an extraordinarily short moment, in 3 weeks, this has never happened. They never do this stuff this fast. In just 3 weeks, they issued a preliminary ruling that said that Israeli actions were potentially genocidal. It's not a final decision. They haven't had all the evidence yet, et cetera. But this is a plausible genocide. And they issued 6 provisional measures that Israel is obligated to take, two of which made essentially a ceasefire, although they didn't use that word. But it was essentially a ceasefire. Israel, of course, ignored that. But it comes again back to us. What do we have to do with that? Other than cheering this incredible team from South Africa when they got up to argue. Anybody here get up at 4 o'clock in the morning the day that they opened their case in The Hague? It was a couple of people. It was one of the most amazing things you will ever see. This rainbow team of 15 people from South Africa, from outside South Africa. The Irish lawyer was one of the stars of it. Black South Africans, Indian, white, incredible. It was just an incredible thing to see. Standing there defending international law on behalf of Palestinians, with Palestinians sitting side by side with them. It was one of those amazing moments. A South African friend of mine that was, she was back in South Africa at the time. I was in Washington. There were a bunch of us that were texting back and forth, and somebody said, she wrote, I have never been so proud to be a South African, and I've never been so proud to be a human being. And it means something for us, not just about cheering them on, but about enforcement. Because what the International Court of Justice has does not include the ability to enforce. They don't have an army. They don't have a police force. They don't even have a process server. What they have is us. They sent their ruling to the United Nations, and the Security Council, of course, makes it possible for the US to just veto it. But then it goes to the General Assembly, where there is no veto. And in an incredible vote of 124 to 14, the General Assembly passed a resolution that took up all of what the International Court had demanded of Israel, and then added some, particularly strong around stopping sending the weapons. This was amazing. And now, they also don't have an army. The General Assembly doesn't have its own enforcement, but it has us. And we have the model, and I want to leave you with this, and then we'll open up for questions or whatever. But I want to leave you with a very important model that we can all look to. I'm looking around, most of you, not all, and I'm glad of that, but most of you are old enough to remember the anti-apartheid movement in the US in the 1980s, right? One of the things that was so extraordinary about that was that you had people all around the world in that movement who were pressuring their own governments to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. The US, of course, was refusing. The Black Caucus of the Congress, which at the time was an incredibly progressive institution, was leading the fight, but they were getting nowhere. But eventually, enough countries all around the world, one after another, after another, after another, people like us were in the streets forcing those governments to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. And eventually, the US caved in. And they were able to pass it in Congress, and when Ronald Reagan vetoed it, they were able to get enough votes to override the veto. And the US imposed sanctions on South Africa. And that was one of the major steps in the struggle to succeed in the movement against apartheid. This is our turn, 40 years later, to say we are going to be the ones globally, our movement globally is going to be what forces the enforcement of what the international judicial operations have all said. This has to stop. It is plausibly genocide, and if it isn't now, it soon will be, and it's the obligation of every country that has ever signed the Genocide Convention to do everything in its power to stop it. So we have a lot of work ahead. That's not going to be an easy task. South Africa didn't have a lobby in those days, right? They didn't have people paying members of Congress millions, tens of millions of dollars to defeat anybody who might dare to vote against aid to Israel, for instance. We have a harder job. But I think we can do it. I'm feeling a little bit of optimism right now. So as bad as the situation is on the ground, I think we have a little bit of room for hope, and I'm hoping we do. Thank you.